The wild part is, Claressa Shields walked into the morning hustle saying people need to keep it boxing, while the entire boxing world, the hip-hop blogs, the podcast clips, and half the internet were already talking about everything except the jab, the footwork, and the belts. And that right there is the real story. Not just that Claressa Shields is one of the greatest fighters we have ever seen, because she is. Not just that she is still chasing more history with an August 15th fight against Kay Scott while dropping weight again, because she is. The real story is that Claressa Shields has built a career so dominant that the sport alone should be enough, and yet somehow every road around her keeps leading back to personality, conflict, public friction, and personal energy. That is not a side plot anymore. That is part of the brand. And if you still think this is just random drama around a star athlete, I need you to stay with me, because I do not think this is random at all. I think the MVP incident, the Alycia Baumgardner tension, the Laila Ali talk, the Breakfast Club relationship headlines, the public defense of her private life, even the way Claressa explains herself when the cameras come on. All of that is connected. Personal stakes? Simple. Every time she wins, the conversation risks drifting away from the accomplishment and toward the noise. Cultural stakes? Even bigger. Women's boxing is still fighting for respect, money, airtime, and mainstream oxygen, and one of its biggest stars keeps proving that attention does not always arrive in a clean box. Systemic stakes? That is where it gets uncomfortable, because when a fighter this great still has to fight for visibility, then maybe the machine itself is rewarding spectacle as much as excellence. And when we get to the business side of why personality keeps getting pulled into the center of Claressa's story, you're going to understand why this is not just about one outspoken champion having another loud month. It is about what the sport keeps asking her to become in order to stay impossible to ignore. Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like, and subscribe. Let's get into it. Now let's set the table properly, because this is where people either get lazy or they start making up fairy tales. Claressa Shields is not some internet celebrity who accidentally wandered into a ring. She is a two-time Olympic gold medalist, a multi-division undisputed champion, and one of the most decorated fighters, male or female, in the modern era. She came out of Flint, built herself into a phenomenon, and has spent years forcing boxing to acknowledge women's greatness in a sport that still pays women less, promotes women less, and too often covers women only when there is a personal angle attached. That matters. Because when Claressa talks loud, talks proud, calls herself the GWOT, challenges legends, or fires back at critics, she is not doing that from nowhere. She is doing that from inside a sport where she has long felt she had to demand the respect that should have been automatic. But here's the twist. The exact traits that helped her force the sport to pay attention are the same traits that now keep dragging the story into personal territory. She does not like being disrespected. She has said that openly in multiple interviews. She does not like being minimized. She does not like people speaking on her personal life while pretending it is still just boxing commentary. And honestly, on a human level, who would? The issue is that Claressa does not merely resist personal narratives. She frequently answers them in a way that keeps the fire hot. She has the kind of public personality that does not just respond to the room. It changes the temperature in the room. So when she says, "Keep it boxing," a lot of people hear the words, but then they look at the pattern and say, "Okay, but why does everything around you end up bigger than the fight?" And that question matters right now because she is still in active motion. She is not retired, not fading out, not doing legacy tours. She is in the middle of chasing more belts, more firsts, more history. The July 2026 press conference for the Kay Scott fight made that clear. Claressa is still presenting herself as the one willing to do the difficult thing, drop weight, take on the risk, and push women's boxing into larger cultural spaces. She talked about skill overriding everything. She talked like a champion. But at the same time, the conversation around her is crowded with all this outside noise, from the Alycia Baumgardner feud to relationship discourse to old rivalries that never quite die. So the tension driving this whole video is not whether Claressa Shields is great. That part is settled. The tension is whether Claressa the all-time fighter and Claressa the all-time headline magnet can still coexist without one constantly hijacking the other. Is she being unfairly dragged into personal chaos by a media ecosystem that feeds on negativity, or has she become so comfortable speaking through conflict that she cannot help but personalize everything around her? That is the real question. Start with the cleanest piece of evidence, because we do not have to guess. In the recent Morning Hustle clip, Claressa flat out said people need to keep it boxing and said she does not do the personal stuff. That is the line. That is the headline. That is the self-description she wants attached to her. She also doubled down that a relationship cannot overshadow her greatness and answered never when asked if her personal life overshadows her boxing. On paper, that sounds airtight. And to be fair, part of what she is saying is true. A relationship should not erase Olympic gold medals. It should not erase undisputed titles. It should not erase sold arenas, groundbreaking paydays, or a resume that is already historic. I agree with her there. But the reason this clip caught fire is because the internet immediately heard the first half, "I don't do the personal stuff," and stacked it against the very public reality of how Claressa often moves. That is not hate. That is contrast. And contrast is where commentary lives. Now go to the second piece of evidence, the Alycia Baumgardner situation. In May 2026, reports and viral footage showed an altercation in a VIP area during an MVP event, with Alycia approaching, Claressa slapping the hand away, security stepping in, and the whole thing exploding across boxing media. Afterward, Claressa posted that Baumgardner had disrespected and threatened her, while Baumgardner publicly framed the situation as unprovoked and said it would be handled legally and professionally. MVP then banned Claressa from its events until further notice. That is not a rumor thread. That is not somebody's cousin on live. That is public footage, public statements, and an official consequence. And it matters, because this was not even a fight promotion built around the two of them. The tension traveled outside the ring and still became the show. Does everybody understand how crazy that actually is? Two elite fighters from different weight realities turned a side space at an event into the biggest boxing clip of the weekend. That is personal energy, whether anybody likes the label or not. And it was not even the first time. Sports Illustrated noted that in April 2024, during another combat sports event, Shields had slapped Baumgardner's hand away in a face-to-face confrontation. So when people act like the 2026 blow-up came out of nowhere, no, it did not. This was a public rivalry that had already learned how to live outside the ropes. There is a pattern here. The conflict does not stay theoretical. It gets embodied. It gets visible. It becomes the clip. And once that happens, nobody is talking about punch selection or ring IQ anymore. They're talking about ego, disrespect, revenge, and who crossed the line. That is exactly the kind of shift Claressa says she does not want. But the public record keeps showing her stepping right into that shift and then trying to reframe it afterward. Third piece of evidence, the relationship conversation. Again, I am not here to moral police grown people. I am here to talk about public positioning. In the Breakfast Club interview and a follow-up Vibe write-up, Claressa openly discussed her relationship with Papoose, spoke about how close they are, said they talk every day, and framed herself as a secure woman who does not do second place. She also said there were personal matters he still needed to handle and that it was the elephant in the room, while saying it was not her place to speak too deeply on it. On one hand, that is measured. On the other hand, once you publicly walk into that conversation, once you start discussing divorce timelines, emotional investment, being together every day, and how the public is reacting, you are no longer operating in a sealed boxing chamber. You are doing personal media. And that is okay. But let us call it what it is. That is the thing with Claressa. She often wants the freedom to answer personally without having the story defined as personal. But that is not how media works. If you tell the public your relationship cannot overshadow your greatness while also discussing the relationship in major interviews, then the relationship has already become part of the narrative architecture. Not bigger than the greatness, but attached to it. And the internet is ruthless about attachment. It will take the belts, the boyfriend, the quote, the clap back, the old feud, and remix it into one giant nonstop movie trailer. That is what happened here. Fourth piece of evidence, Laila Ali. This is where the always personal theme gets even more interesting because it is not just drama in the low sense. Sometimes the personal angle is competitive pride dressed in legacy language. Claressa publicly pushed the idea of fighting Laila Ali and later said Ali was scared to fight her after a reported $15 million offer. Laila responded publicly that she was flattered, had not been actively thinking about coming back, and that people had run with the money talk in ways she had not personally committed to. Now look at that carefully. Even when the topic is pure boxing on the surface, legacy, money, comeback, mega fight, it still becomes emotional theater about fear, bluffing, backpedaling, and who really wants it. Claressa is exceptional at turning a sporting disagreement into a character test. That is one of her superpowers. It is also one of the reasons people say she makes it personal. And I think we just need to set the truth on what is actually happening here. When Claressa says people need to keep it boxing, what she really seems to mean is this: critique my ring work if you want, question my opponents if you want, debate my legacy if you want, but do not use my personal life, my body, my femininity, or my relationships as your shortcut. That part is fair. But the contradiction is that Claressa herself rarely speaks like a robot athlete reading from a sponsor card. She speaks like a whole person. Proud, emotional, blunt, sometimes messy, often funny, always direct. So the minute she feels disrespected, the language changes. The conversation stops being just about boxing and becomes about what kind of person said what, who really hates her, who is intimidated, who is lying, who is fake, who is ducking, who is using narratives, who cannot say it to her face. That is not ring analysis anymore. That is identity warfare. And Claressa, whether intentionally or not, is very, very good at identity warfare. And oh, do I have more? Because if you thought this was just about a couple of bad clips and one loud interview, the Claressa defenders are really not going to like the next part. This is where the story stops being she's misunderstood and starts becoming the misunderstanding itself is part of the engine. Because once you line up the hip-hop crossover, the podcast circuit, the fan reactions, and the way even her supporters describe her, you start to see that Claressa Shields is not simply trapped in personal headlines. She is one of the few athletes in women's boxing who knows how to weaponize visibility, even when that visibility comes with smoke attached. And when we get to the business breakdown after this, you are going to see why the sport may have quietly trained her to do exactly that. Now let's move into the cultural evidence, because this is where the story gets bigger than one fighter having a short fuse. First, look at how Claressa is positioned in hip-hop spaces. XXL did a full feature connecting her to rap culture, her ring walks with artists, her love of rap as an expression of struggle and self-definition, and her view that rappers and boxers have a lot in common because both are built around hustle, image, flash, and earning everything the hard way. That matters because once you move beyond boxing media into hip-hop media, personality is not an accessory. Personality is currency. In those spaces, being quotable is part of being relevant. Being direct is part of being legible. Being a little dangerous with your words is part of the draw. So when Claressa steps into those rooms and talks like Claressa, she is not off-brand. She is perfectly on-brand for a culture that rewards confidence, confrontation, and mythology. Second, listen to how she describes criticism in longer interviews. On Club Shay Shay, she said she has a no-back-down attitude, said she does not take disrespect, and even described herself at one point as a disguised killer. Whether you love that or hate that, that is not the language of somebody trying to become less confrontational in public. That is the language of somebody who sees confrontation as part of the self. She also talked about internet critics, about people saying things online they would never say face-to-face, and about how she has actually confronted disrespect head-on in real life. Again, I am not endorsing every story or every choice. I am saying the persona is consistent. She does not present herself as passive. She presents herself as someone who answers pressure with more pressure. So when fans later act shocked that a Claressa Shields feud spills over emotionally, I kind of want to ask, have you been listening to her for the last few years or not? Third, the way her supporters defend her actually proves part of the point. Her defenders usually do not say she is quiet, reserved, above the noise, and impossible to provoke. No, they say she is real. They say she stands on business. They say she says what others are too fake to say. They say the world is uncomfortable with a black woman who is both elite and unapologetically loud. And some of that is true. Some criticism toward Claressa absolutely does carry gendered nonsense. She has said people want her to just be a boxer, not wear heels, not wear makeup, not present as glamorous and dangerous at the same time. I believe there is truth there. But watch what happens culturally. The very traits that make people rally around her as authentic are the same traits that make every conflict feel personal, because authenticity, when pushed to the limit, starts sounding like confrontation without filters. Fourth, there is the Papoose effect. Not because of gossip for gossip's sake, but because it reveals how Claressa's story has now crossed fully into lifestyle media, relationship media, and shade blog discourse. Once Vibe is covering your boxing interview primarily through the lens of romance and divorce drama, once fans are quoting your "I don't do second place" line more than your last jab sequence, the culture has already made its decision about what version of you drives traffic this week. And here is where I will add nuance, because it matters. That is not entirely her fault. Media ecosystems pick angles. They flatten complexity. They chase what converts. If Claressa says 10 smart things about boxing economics and one emotional thing about love, there are plenty of outlets that will make the headline about love. That is real. But here is the counterargument, and it is the one Claressa fans lean on all the time. She's only responding to what people bring to her. Fair point. Sometimes that is absolutely true. Interviewers bait. Social media trolls bait. Rival fighters bait. Legacy names bait. If the room keeps throwing personal jabs, then yes, the fighter may respond personally. I get it. But that counterargument falls apart when responding becomes part of the public rhythm rather than the exception. Once there is a repeated pattern of personal rebuttal, personal framing, personal challenge, personal pride, and personal identity language, then the issue is not merely what people brought to her. The issue is how consistently she chooses to answer. And Claressa chooses to answer like somebody who sees every slight as a referendum on her whole being, not just her belt count. That is why the cultural mood around her is so split. One side sees a once-in-a-generation champion who refuses to shrink herself for anybody. The other side sees a champion who keeps lending oxygen to stories that do not help her legacy breathe cleaner. And both sides, honestly, have receipts. That is what makes this so compelling. This is not a cheap one-note story where one person is obviously right and everyone else is crazy. This is a story about a fighter whose authenticity is both her shield and her spark plug. She uses it to defend herself. She also uses it to ignite the room. And if you have made it this far in the video, I need you to lock in, because now we have to make the hard pivot. Now we have to leave the gossip floor and walk upstairs into the boardroom. Because the deeper truth here is not just about Claressa Shields as a personality. It is about the incentives around Claressa Shields as a business. Let's talk about the first systemic angle. Women's boxing has historically underpaid and underpromoted elite female fighters, and Claressa has been explicit about that for years. AP and CBS both documented how she was pushing gender equality issues in boxing, including unequal TV time, unequal promotion, and unequal pay. She became one of the first women in the sport to secure seven-figure paydays, and even those achievements were framed as breakthroughs rather than norms. Think about what that means psychologically and strategically. If you are one of the greatest fighters alive and greatness alone still has to fight for budget, airtime, and historical respect, then pure excellence does not feel like enough. So, what do stars do in systems that underpay the product? They become bigger than the product. They become headline machines. They become conversation generators. They become impossible to bench. That is the first key. Claressa's loudness is not happening in a vacuum. It was shaped in a market that kept telling women fighters, directly and indirectly, that belts are amazing, but eyeballs move the number. This is why the second systemic angle matters: crossover culture. The current version of Claressa is not being marketed only as a boxer. She is being marketed through boxing, yes, but also through hip-hop alignment, personality media, mainstream podcasts, and entertainment crossover. Look at the K. Scott event language. It is not just fight promotion. It is boxing plus music plus Zeus plus DAZN plus celebrity undercard culture. That is not accidental. That is a strategy. Claressa herself talked in XXL about how hip-hop and boxing share a hustle grammar. The promoters are clearly leaning into that ecosystem too. And once you live in that ecosystem, silence is not neutral. Silence is dead air. Personality fills the vacuum. Now ask yourself what kind of athlete thrives best in that climate. Not the one who politely waits for analysts to appreciate the footwork. The one who can walk into the Breakfast Club, Club Shay Shay, Morning Hustle, or any big platform and become the moment. Claressa can do that. She is not stiff. She is not media trained into oblivion. She can talk pain, ego, money, relationships, misogyny, legacy, and violence in the same long-form sit-down. That has enormous value. It also blurs the line between fighter and content engine. And once you become a content engine, the machine starts rewarding whatever version of you creates the strongest response. If your calm technical breakdown gets 50,000 views, but your emotional line about not doing second place gets 500,000, guess which version of you the media keeps inviting back? Here comes the third systemic angle, and this one is the most uncomfortable. The same institutions that celebrate Claressa's authenticity also profit from her contradictions. They profit from the quote where she says a relationship cannot overshadow her greatness. They profit from the clip where she says keep it boxing. They profit from the confrontation footage. They profit from the fight announcement. They profit from the love story. They profit from the beef. Everybody wins when Claressa is legible as both champion and chaos. The one person who may lose in that setup is Claressa's legacy clarity, because the cleaner the story, the less clickable it sometimes becomes. Can we have the real conversation now? If Claressa were a quieter fighter with the exact same resume, would women's boxing have given her everything she deserved? I do not think so. I think part of why she broke through is because she was willing to be enormous in public. I think calling herself the GWAT before the whole world was comfortable saying it forced people to confront the resume sooner. I think challenging icons, demanding money, refusing modesty, embracing crossover culture, all of that helped move her from elite boxer to must-cover figure. But that same strategy has attacks. Once your public self is built on magnitude, every disagreement risks becoming a referendum. Every rival becomes a symbol. Every question becomes disrespect. Every reaction becomes content. And that explains the always personal label better than any lazy moral rant ever could. It is not merely that Claressa enjoys conflict. It is that she has lived in an economy that keeps proving conflict has exchange value. Not because she cannot box. Precisely because she can box, and yet boxing by itself has never paid women what the market pays spectacle. So when she turns interviews into declarations, when she makes legacy names answer back, when she refuses to let insults sit, she is not just being impulsive. She is operating in a system where attention has long been a secondary championship belt. The messed up part is that once you win that belt, it starts defending itself. The noise keeps asking for more noise. That is why I keep saying the misunderstanding is part of the engine. Fans say, why does everybody focus on the drama? Because the infrastructure is built to elevate drama. Critics say, why does Claressa keep making it personal? Because personal framing is one of the few levers that reliably expands the audience beyond hardcore boxing. Promoters say they want excellence, but excellence plus volatility sells cleaner than excellence alone. Podcast hosts say they are just asking questions, but they know exactly which clip will travel. Nobody is innocent in this. Not the media. Not the fans. Not the rivals. And not Claressa. So here is the truth bomb. Claressa Shields is not always personal because she accidentally loses focus. Claressa Shields is always personal because her career has taught her that being impersonal is a luxury the system rarely rewards. That is the bomb. That is the payoff. The contradiction people mock is also the adaptation that helped build her empire. She says keep it boxing because the boxer in her knows that should be enough. She answers emotionally because the public figure in her knows that, too often, it is not enough. And until those two realities stop colliding, every Claressa Shields victory will carry a sidecar of personal narrative attached to it. That does not mean every criticism of her is fair. It does not mean every reaction from her is wise. It does not mean the internet's obsession with her relationships is healthy. It does not mean rival fighters are innocent. It means the entire ecosystem around her has normalized the idea that a woman can be one of the greatest ever and still need extra spectacle to receive fully inflated mainstream attention. That is the ugly part. And once Claressa learned that lesson, she became incredibly good at surviving inside it. Think about how devastating that is for the culture. You have a fighter whose resume should be enough to center pure greatness, and yet the surrounding machine keeps translating greatness into personality battles because personality battles travel faster. Then fans turn around and blame the fighter alone for being loud, as if silence would have produced equal money, equal promotion, and equal respect. No, silence might have produced elegance. It might also have produced invisibility. That is the trap. Claressa did not invent the trap, but she absolutely knows how to move inside it. And the consequences are real. The more the story becomes Claressa the headline, the more each opponent risks becoming secondary to the atmosphere. The more each interview becomes a conflict lab, the more every achievement has to fight through static to be appreciated cleanly. The more each public answer becomes a personal answer, the more her critics feel licensed to treat her life as open season. That is the debt you rack up when your brand is built on being untouchably visible. The room never really lets you leave the stage. But here is where the emotional landing gets interesting. The hero of this story is still Claressa, just not every version of Claressa. The hero is the locked-in Claressa. The one who can walk into a press conference, talk about cutting weight, skill, endurance, and taking another hard challenge. The one who forced seven-figure conversations into women's boxing. The one who came out of Flint, out of trauma, out of poverty, out of doubt, and built a life bigger than the circumstances that tried to box her in. The one BBC profiled as a fighter shaped by pain and self-reliance. The one AP and CBS framed as a central figure in the battle for respect and equality in the sport. That Claressa is still winning. Loudly. That is why this is not a funeral video. This is not career over. This is not legacy ruined. Relax. One person makes headlines because the internet loves confusion. The other makes history because the work is undeniable. And in Claressa's case, both of those people happen to live in the same body. That is the tension. But when the gloves go on, history keeps beating headlines. That is the point. Alycia clips trend. Laila talk trends. Relationship discourse trends. But at the end of the day, the belt sheet still reads like greatness. The resume still reads like greatness. The career earnings breakthroughs still matter. The arenas still fill. The August 15th fight still moves forward. And I want everybody to understand this clearly. The reason Claressa can even survive all this noise is because the boxing is real. If the talent were fake, the controversies would have buried her. They did not. Because when the skill is elite, the chaos becomes commentary instead of obituary. That is why I keep separating the versions. The most dangerous enemy to Claressa Shields is not Alycia Baumgardner, not Laila Ali, not the blogs, not the trolls. It is the possibility that the chaos version of her keeps stealing time from the championship version of her. If she controls that balance, she stays untouchable in legacy terms. If she does not, then the public keeps consuming her career as a reality show with belts attached. Still, the right person is winning right now, and I mean that. Not the trolls. Not the opportunists. Not the people who only log on when there is smoke. The athlete is still winning. The discipline side is still producing outcomes. The proof is in the continued opportunities, the continued headline positioning, the continued willingness of promoters and platforms to build around her. You do not get that if the core product is broken. You get that because the core product is elite, and everyone knows it, even while pretending the side noise is the whole meal. This is only the start though, because there are at least two concrete things to watch from here. First is the K. Scott fight itself. If Claressa goes out there, makes weight, performs at a high level, and reminds everybody why skill overrides the drama, then the whole conversation shifts again. Not permanently, because this is the internet and permanence died years ago, but enough to reset the terms. Second is whether the outside stories keep following her into every media cycle. Does the Alycia situation keep producing fallout? Does the public keep dragging relationship content into boxing conversations? Does Claressa decide to lean harder into personal candor, or does she tighten the frame and force interviewers back toward the sport? Those are not small questions. Those are the next chapter. And that is why if you are watching this channel, you already know I am going to stay on it, because this is not just celebrity mess to me. This is a live case study in what modern sports fame does to elite women who refuse to be quiet. There is more coming. More clips, more reactions, more promotional pivots, more attempts to turn every quote into a battlefield. So if you want the version of the story that is actually looking at the culture, the business, and the psychology instead of just screaming over screenshots, stay locked in here. And the next video needs to be the one where we break down whether Claressa Shields' August 15th fight is really about another belt, or whether it is the moment she takes the whole narrative back from the chaos machine. Because if she wins big after all this noise, then the shock is not the victory. The shock is what that victory exposes about who really needed the drama more, Claressa or the industry built around her.